Okay, just put this here. Okay, so today I wanted to chat about kind of the state of chatbots and LLMs that is essentially the big hype. This is updated today. There's been, in the past 3 days alone, there's been a handful of changes that yeah, that will speak to. But more or less, I'm assuming that you've all have been in this space where you're looking at the landscape that's continuously changing, and you're thinking to yourselves, okay, everyone is talking about these new tools, but it's a bit unclear for me exactly how I can use these tools, right? How can these tools help me clear my inbox? What exactly is a GPT? Do I even need a chatbot in my tooling or on my website? If I have a chatbot, how do people interact with it? Are there ways that I can automate my things, my work away? It's a bit chaotic, right? All these questions are happening at the same time. All these new technologies are getting released seemingly every single day, and it's simple to be in a place where you might feel a bit overwhelmed. Uh, that being said, I think a good way to address a bit of this overwhelm is to first talk about why we're here, right? What are large language models? So I'm sure everyone has an overview, but just so we're making sure we're talking more or less the same language, I'm going to use the acronym LLM during my presentation, and LLM stands for large language models, right? These are systems that are built on billions of data points that are essentially mathematical functions on functions, and they work to just predict new groups of words in some kind of context. So that being said, these systems are built on human data, therefore they have a bit of human bias, and in doing so, they allow us to interact with something that's really natural, which is why these systems are really popular now, right? We're just texting something. In theory, we have this perception that we're talking to a human, and oftentimes we give it human level intelligence, and oftentimes we don't call it an it, or we call it a she, right? Uh, if you have an iPhone, you have your four-letter friend that starts with S. When sometimes I'm not even going to say it on the call because I know my microphone will jump to my phone if I do so. But we all have, whether it's Siri or Alexa. All these tools more or less are powered by the same thing, right? There's data, there's tons of data, there's tons of math that sits on top of the data, and they give us the perception that we're looking at something that's more or less intelligent. But that's really important to note moving forward. So here's just a little overview of the landscape of large language models right now. Um, these are a handful of open and closed source. A handful of them are integrating with things like Google or Facebook. Some are open sourced. As I said, some came out. Grok is the last one, which is Elon Musk's Twitter's platform, which just came out a few days ago. This landscape is constantly changing, but these players are more or less the industry leaders. It seems that every few weeks there are new benchmarks for measuring things like coding skills or um, mathematical um, mathematical proofs or things like riddles. And depending on how these tools rate, more or less, they're always in the top group. It just decides which one is the top one for the month. More or less, though, every month this is constantly changing and shifting. Last year alone, the biggest player, OpenAI, from 2023 to 24, has dropped 16 points. Right? Anthropic has gone up 12. And this is changing. As I said, there's some on this landscape that weren't even released last year that are still now making huge tidal waves, specifically Grok and DeepSeek. Grok, again, is from Twitter, and DeepSeek is from a hedge fund based in China. So I guess you're probably still back at this. What does this all mean, right? This thing is constantly changing. How is this valuable for me? The best way that I like to break down large language models, LLMs, and the way to use them is in more or less three groupings. And I like to think of it in the scale of complexity. When we interact with these things, we are deciding how much information to give it, and we get different responses when we do so. So the standard way, which I'm sure everyone is super comfortable with using, is basic prompting. The pros, this is super easy. We can save time. We can save effort. The cons, sometimes we get really ambiguous answers. So, for example, saying something like, "I hurt my knee. What do you think it is we might get literally thousands of different answers, and oftentimes we know that when we go to the internet for medical advice, it's going to say something really morbid and sad and not necessarily helpful or beneficial. Then we have advanced prompting, which is where we can provide a bit more context. It's a bit more complex because of it, but saying something like, "Okay, I want you to act as a physical therapist or an osteopath, and I was walking and I slipped, and this is how I slipped. This is what it felt like. What do you think might be going on with my knee?" And the answer is going to be, sure, it takes a bit more time, but it is going to be significantly more detailed and more useful, right? Depending on the context in which we give these systems. Of course, we get to the point of saying, okay, well, do we want to tell it to be an osteopath, or do we want it to be a orthopedic, or do we want to tell it to act as a surgeon? We introduce a bit of decision paralysis. And this more or less is kind of the state that everyone's in right now. I'm assuming when we use chatbots, it's like, okay, I'm going to tell it to act as an expert copywriter and I'm going to give it some text and it's going to go through and give me some feedback. Or I'm going to tell it to act as a Michelin star chef and I'm going to give it a recipe or a question about a recipe and it will give it a very different answer as if we were just saying act as an amateur chef. This more or less is kind of the norm. This is where everyone is. But there is a step past it, right, which is fine tuning. And fine tuning is going a bit beyond prompting, and it's using the system to provide so much context that in theory, we're kind of restructuring this data that I was talking about that is powering the LLMs in the first place. While this does take a good amount of resources to set up, we get tons of assurance to make sure that the result that we get is going to be compliant to whatever kind of, say, measurements or heuristics that we put in the system. And at the same time, we can be fully customizable. So an example of this is, let's say we have um, a camera company and you have all this data about different lenses and all the physics describing how these things work and all the different bodies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can feed something like this and fine tune a system and ask a question that is going to be equally as specific as tons of the documentation that you gave it in the first place, right? You can say, is, this kind of lens possible, or is this kind of orientation possible? And in terms of collaboration and discovery, this is when we start pushing against the limit of how people are using the systems now. And we go from a place of using technologies to end up collaborating with them, right? As we start giving them more and more data, as we start giving them the ability to even connect to other systems, we then start introducing what is now being called this AI agent. It's a term that has been around actually for a very long time, um, but right now it's all the rave. It's the hype, right? There's also a term agentic, agentic, to just as a verb to describe whether or not a LLM or an AI is has the capabilities to more or less be empowered to make decisions, right? To have autonomy. Traditionally, these LLMs were around giving simple tasks and automating them. For example, I need you to take this data set and plug it into an Excel spreadsheet. Or traditionally, they were used in a way that was just really task focused, like, okay, here's my data. I'm just going to have this thing work and just translate data from point A to point B, as well as just in a limited space, right? It was just using this data. It was just using this Excel spreadsheet. It wasn't doing anything else. And we went from this really contained way of using it into now this agent, right? Where we have autonomy, we have tooling, and even this perception of reasoning. As I said before, remember we have human data, more human-like interaction. Um, there's different ways that these systems can be used to also orchestrate their own data before they give it to you. And what it does is it allows us to have kind of a new way of thinking about these tools. As instead of being a tool, now it's a co-pilot and it's a collaborator. The way that I interact with this tool now, it can ask me questions and it can provoke me to think about things differently. At the same time, I can ask it questions and it can more or less understand the context of these different spaces to say, okay, well, you asked me about this three questions ago. And we started then talking about, the difference between, going back to the cooking example, the difference between different types of fats and what fat does to food, as a means to deliver flavor. And looking back on this conversation, we were talking about, why the fats are essential and blah blah blah, and it can kind of connect these threads together. And then, of course, if you're in the context of space of, let's say, making a really good tiramisu, that at the end of it, okay, you're going to get a tiramisu formula, that a recipe that's going to be spot on, right? Depending on what you have in your kitchen. So you're able to really have an exchange with this tool. It's not just something that gets you from point A to point B, but it's something that can adaptively learn. And the really cool thing with these tooling now is that agents are able to connect to other computers with what's called an application protocol interface, an API, an API for some. But a lot of companies allow their systems to be able to be interacted with other tools or code. And now you're able to then allow these agents to interact with this code. So you can create, for example, AI agents that can connect across a variety of different tooling. And it leads us to a space now where essentially the market is becoming saturated, right? Here are all of the more or less the encompassing landscape of the way agents are being used. There's just general assistance, copywriting, email automation, creating video, checking text, doing graphic design, managing social media, building your resume, recruiting people who have probably built their resumes with AI, solving math problems, personalized education tools. There's tons. There's tons and tons and tons. But the long and short of it is there is a uh, vast power that's being unlocked now because these tools are all interconnected. So that brings us to the space now where we have this big divide, more or less, between commercial and open source tools. Because in seemingly everyone can build anything, it seems we have now a separation between people who are making these tools to profit and people who are making these tools just to, let's say, open source them, whatever their intentions are, right? Maybe to make the world better, maybe just to have something that's accessible and open. While that's the case, the good thing is the benchmarks don't necessarily show a difference between the effectiveness of these tools. So while the US government just said they're going to put $500 billion into AI to make these tools more affordable and accessible, at the same, essentially within the same month, a Chinese company was able to make a system that was just as good and just throw it up online for anyone to use. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. Mark Andreessen, who's an investor, has said that all these companies are in a race to the bottom. Selling intelligence is like selling a grain of rice. And truly, you can see with these charts that these companies are becoming, this technology is becoming more and more democratized. Everyone is trying to save time and save money. The data is more accessible. The hardware to run this data is more accessible. And the pricing is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper by every year. No, there's four main ways that I want to highlight how easy it is to use this technology. The first one is if you have credit card and the internet access and you want to pay 15 bucks a month, you're more or less set. You can use all of these tools. If you have some technical skills and you want to watch a little video on YouTube or read a blog and you have a decent computer, you can run these local tools on your machine, as I said, that are just as good as the commercial tools, but that are open source where you can customize them. Going further, if you have more advanced skills, you can use something that is a lot more around kind of creating an architecture that you can send a whole bunch of data into the large language model, which Manel will talk about in a second, that makes it so you can have a bit more customization in your response, right? Again, we were talking about complexity, getting closer to this idea of something that's more fine-tuned. In a week, in a couple of days, you can be set and good to go. And the last level of complexity is if now with the accessibility of papers and actual physical computing hardware, within a week, you can essentially build your entirely new LLM, which is why the market is getting more and more saturated. But it's why there's so much right now that can be that can really be used. And I don't want it to be overwhelming for everyone to think that, well, there's so much to use. What do I want to do? I really think that it's as simple as just pick something, really pick something and experiment. And if you're not using large language models for business in 2025, it's clear that soon you will start missing out on time and money that the entire every industry, as I said, as I showed with this chart, and warned us, every industry is getting affected in a way that is getting radicalized with AI. So that's kind of where I wanted to leave us today. And yeah, I'm happy to talk about this more in the breakout rooms. And really, thank you everyone for your thoughts, and I'm excited to hear what you all have to think about this.